Are you someone who is interested in ancient history? Perhaps you're someone new to it all. Alternatively, you might be someone who's studied or read a bit about it. Or maybe you're in between. Whatever your interest level or how much you know, the Ancient History Hound podcast could be the podcast for you. Hi, my name's Neil, and as you've probably guessed, I'm the host. I love ancient history. I studied it at uni many years ago. In fact, back then it was called Current Affairs. My podcast is all about finding interesting areas of ancient history and talking about it. I sometimes have guests, and there's a variety of topics. You can check for yourself. Just use the platform you get your podcasts on and have a look. I reckon there'll be something you'll want to listen to. The next time you have a few minutes, why not check out the Ancient History Hound podcast? It will be great to have you join me.
Welcome to Badass Short Stories from Byzantium, where I will take a deeper dive into the topics otherwise briefly mentioned in the episodes proper. I am your host, Keith Hernandez, and today we will be talking about an attempt to reawaken the Eastern Roman Phoenix. I'd like to say up top that today's episode will not be so ancient or medieval. In fact, it's going to take place for the most part in the 19th and 20th centuries. I apologize if you're put off by that fact. I don't plan to venture this far into the modern day again, but I at least want to say that you'll be missing a particularly interesting story if you choose to tune out now. I'm going to tell you about a concept that was born not long after the emergence of the Kingdom of Greece in 1832, that if carried out then and there, would have made the world a much different place today. For example, if it had gone into effect before the turn of the 20th century, there might not have been a Balkan crisis to prelude World War I, because there might not have been a Balkan War. Or maybe the powder keg that was Eastern Europe in the early 20th century would have exploded much sooner. I'm not going to pretend to know all the ways in which history could have been altered in this area and time, as I'm not an expert, but expert or not, it does make one wonder. I'm sure by now you're wondering to yourself, what does this all have to do with Byzantium? Well, if this idea, which I promise I will explain very shortly, had been fully realized, there's a chance we would be talking about a real, breathing Eastern Roman Empire, not as a lesson in a textbook or a story on a podcast, but as a corporal place on a modern map. We would be doing so because if this idea were carried out to its logical conclusion by the turn of the 20th century, there would have been a state encompassing much of the lands the Empire of Old laid claim to in the Middle Ages, run and inhabited once again by a Greek-speaking Eastern Orthodox majority, effectively replacing Ottoman rule in the Balkans and parts of Anatolia. What this state would have looked like today is anyone's guess. Likewise, there's no guarantee that it would have even been called the Roman Empire, or that any such association with the recent and painful past would have been an attractive notion. But again, like I said, it makes one wonder. So without further ado, what I would like to talk about today is what's known as the Megali idea, or the Grand Idea, and the attempts by the Kingdom of Greece to carry it out, as told in modern Greek historian Roderick Beaton's Greece, Biography of a Modern Nation. Simply put, the Grand Idea was the desire by the Greek people, starting in the mid-19th century, to unite all native Greek speakers, not just the ones in the newly formed Kingdom of Greece. This so-called Grand Idea started to gain political traction a couple decades into the Greek kingdom's existence, when the Hellenic-centric state warmed to the notion that the history of the Greek-speaking people included not just an ancient Hellenic past, but a medieval Byzantine one as well. The natural conclusion to this thinking was that Greek speakers who encompassed areas once under control of the Byzantine Empire, and now under Ottoman control, should be included in this new Greek state. Of course, not everyone within Greece agreed on what or who exactly to include in this idea. These parameters often changed. Sometimes survival demanded such change. Stronger nations, such as Britain, at various points in history did not see eye to eye with the Greek master plan, and through gunboat diplomacy made damn well sure the new kingdom knew it. Other times, it was the realization of the idea itself, or the very people it sought to bring into the fold, that brought on this change. These, quote, new Greeks were not always looked upon so kindly by the old. Not even all Greeks abroad were pining for a unified Greece, as reforms under the Ottomans were starting to elevate those who were once deemed second-class citizens throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. I think it's important to acknowledge these points now, as I won't be visiting them much throughout the story. And while we're on the caveat train, let's address a few more things. First, I want to be clear I have greatly simplified this concept, and I encourage further reading if you're interested in how it got started, who exactly promoted it, and how it emerged to the forefront of Greek thought. Second, I realize talking about concepts such as de jure nationhood can spur up strong feelings in those involved even today. So I want to make it clear I do not have a dog in this fight. And that leads to my final caveat, that this was not necessarily thought of as the rebirth of the Roman Empire. So it's not my intention to sell the idea as such. Though all one has to do is look at a map of Greek pretensions from the Paris Peace Conference after World War I to see a very familiar sight. By the way, you can do so easily on the Wikipedia page for the Megali idea if you're curious. Not that I got my research there. I would love to hear your thoughts. And one last final thing, I promise. I have to correct something I said in the last episode. Episode 6, Are You Romeos? I said Dr. Artemis Leontis was a modern Greek historian. She is in fact not a historian, but a literary scholar of modern Greek and comparative literature. It is my understanding that historians are protective about who is and who is not a historian. So, my apologies for the mistake. Okay, enough caveats and corrections. Let's get to it. In the later half of the 19th century and first half of the 20th centuries, the grand idea would become central to foreign policy for Greece. It would be attempted through diplomacy and military force on many occasions, some proving successful. I want to talk about some of these failures and successes, and whether or not we could call the overall execution of the idea a grand success. It was perhaps first tested in the 1850s, during the Crimean War, after the Ottoman Empire sided with France over a land dispute in Ottoman-controlled Jerusalem between France and Russia. More specifically, the two European giants were tussling over guardianship of holy places within the city. Russia, angered by the outcome of the deal, went to war with the Ottoman Empire. This caught the attention of King Otto of Greece, who saw in a weakened Ottoman state the chance to extend Greece's borders. Rebellions in Ottoman-controlled Epirus and Crete were whipped up with the support of Athens, and Greek irregulars crossed into the northern border. So too was the grand idea crossing from idealism into reality. But despite the enthusiasm from within Greece and by Greek subjects in nearby Ottoman territory, not everyone saw the decline of the Ottoman Empire, by now dubbed the sick man of Europe, as a good thing, especially not at the expense of Russian gains. It was natural, then, that intervention from Britain and France followed in 1854. The two great powers sent troops into Crimea, where most of the fighting was to take place. As for Greece, it was to recall its paramilitaries abroad. When King Otto refused, the British and French opted for gunboat diplomacy, blockading the Greek port of Piraeus, and forcing Greece into a humiliating position of neutrality for the rest of the war, which Russia lost. Not every attempt to carry out the grand idea would prove so unsuccessful, but Greece would see more failures than wins in the 19th century. Despite this fact, the desire to unite all Greek peoples would persevere, serving as a beacon of hope for a young nation going through growing pains. This desire was on full display as Greece witnessed an independence movement across the Adriatic Sea that would create the Kingdom of Italy. The goal of incorporating Rome into this new kingdom did not go unnoticed by Greek subjects, who wished to do the same for Constantinople. But the Greek king Otto had no desire to entertain such notions after the embarrassment he suffered in the Crimean War. This, coupled with his lack of appetite for reform, led to revolts in the early 1860s, which in turn led to Otto's abdication in 1862. That it would be wise to read the room at home, rather than appease the great powers of Europe, would set the tone for all future leaders of Greece. This podcast was brought to you by Podcorn. Are you a budding podcaster looking to monetize your content, but aren't sure where to begin? Here at Badass Stories from Byzantium, I was in the same boat. Searching for sponsors was time-consuming and overwhelming, and many simply had no time for smaller podcasts. But then I found Podcorn, who not only took the legwork out of the chase, but also found the right sponsors for me, so I could focus on creating quality content. Podcorn is a marketplace connecting podcasters to amazing podcast sponsorship opportunities, such as host-read ads, interview segments, topical discussions, and more. With Podcorn, there is no middleman. Podcasters of all sizes can browse and choose opportunities right on the platform, set their own rates, and collaborate with brands directly without any exclusivities. You never have to give up any rights to your podcast, and Podcorn is here to support you at every step and ensure you're protected and compensated for the work that you do for brands. The marketplace mission is to give podcasters transparency, creative freedom, and full control of how and when to monetize. Click the link in my show notes to sign up to Podcorn and start browsing sponsorship opportunities. Under the newly elected King George I, appropriately dubbed King of the Hellenes, the grand idea saw material gains, first with the handing over of the Ionian Islands by Great Britain in 1864. These are a group of islands just off the Greek coast in the Adriatic Sea. King George I would make 4 more attempts to expand Greece in the 19th century, but find success in only one of them. The Russians and Ottomans went to war once again in 1877, and in the aftermath, Thessaly was ceded to the Kingdom of Greece as a reward for siding with the victorious Russians. More than 213 square kilometers and a sizable portion of Muslim subjects, in addition to the Greek majority, were brought into the Greek kingdom. If the failures of Greek expansion in the 19th century were a sign the country was too young and too ambitious, success in the 20th century would prove otherwise. With 2 expansions under his belt, there was a lot of work to be done by the King of Hellenes, George I, as the majority of Greek speakers still resided outside of the kingdom at the turn of the century. Revolution and the emergence of other Balkan states at Ottoman expense would hurry these Greek ambitions along. See, there were others who were tired of Ottoman rule. Chief among these were the Bulgarians, who declared independence in 1908, followed by Montenegro in 1910. These 2 states, along with the recently established Kingdom of Serbia and Greece, formed what came to be known as the Balkan League, a quadruple alliance that would serve as a check to Ottoman domination in Eastern Europe. The strength of the League was tested in 1912 when Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire, kicking off the First Balkan War. The other 3 states soon followed suit, Greece sending troops into Macedonia and Thessaly. The Greek navy quickly took control of islands in the Aegean, including Lemnos, Chios, and Imbros, where, if you remember, the distressed Roman Constantinopolitans stopped on their way to Venetian territory hundreds of years before. It then pressed onward, blocking the straits that led in from the Mediterranean. On the land side, King George I, his son, Crown Prince Constantine, and Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos marched together into Salonika, once known as Thessalonica, the second city of the Byzantine Empire that fell to Ottoman hands in the 15th century. With Bulgarian forces approaching Constantinople, peace talks would begin shortly thereafter, and the war would conclude March 6, 1913, with Greek troops taking the city of Ioannina in Epirus. It was truly a glorious moment for the King of Hellenes, but not one he would be able to relish in for long, for an assassin would take his life later that month, with a gunshot to the back. A second war would break out between the victors of the first, Greece and Serbia defending their gains against Bulgarian aggression, and Romania joining the fray. This too would end well for Greece. When all was finally said and done, it had incorporated much of Thessaly, Macedonia, and Crete, increasing its territory by 68% and doubling its population from 2.7 million to 4.8 million. But not all of these new nationals were Greeks, however, as the Hellenic kingdom had inherited sizable minorities such as Muslims, Slavic-speaking Christians, and Jewish communities. Nonetheless, the state was now taking great leaps towards realizing its grand idea. The 2 million Greek speakers who remained outside of the kingdom, mostly in Ottoman Thrace and Anatolia, and by now facing an increasingly hostile Muslim population, would soon be reunited with their cousins across the Aegean Sea. It's June 28th, 1914, and a young Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip has just shot to death the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne. A month later, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, and just like that, a gust of oxygen breathed new life into the fire that had been smoldering in Eastern Europe after the Balkan Wars. I'm sure many of you listening understand the events I'm laying out and their significance, but for those of you who don't, this is the beginning of the First World War. A war that will kill millions and bring incomprehensible misery onto millions more. If you're looking to waste a day or two, and I don't really mean waste because you'll learn quite a bit and be very entertained, I highly recommend listening to Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon. It's a podcast series in which he covers World War I in only a way he can do it, with a sharp eye for the human experience in times of great distress. I give this recommendation mainly because, although I'd love to go on and on about this great war, I did set up parameters for the podcast and this episode, and I'm sure you're hoping I get to the point sooner than later. To that end, Greece had a decision to make at the outset of the war. Join the Triple Entente, which consisted of Great Britain, France, and Russia, or the Central Alliance, which consisted of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Out of all the reasons to choose the former, two stand out in my mind. First, because Greece was situated all along the Mediterranean Sea, which was dominated by the British and French navies. Second, because the Ottoman Empire joined the conflict later that year, on the side of the Central Alliance. An opportunity to snuff out its Ottoman foe once and for all, and to finish its grand idea, was at last on the table. But it wasn't going to be that easy. The Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos saw the opportunity, and so did many other Greeks. But King Constantine, who had taken a German bride and attended the German military academy, did not believe the Entente could be victorious. Instead of opportunism, he vied instead for survival, and did not wish to involve Greece in the great conflict. This inner conflict would erupt to such a level that the Prime Minister would resign in March 1915 before the disastrous Gallipoli landings by the Entente. He supposedly said with teary eyes, "Tomorrow the Allies will be the masters of the Dardanelles, and the day after of Constantinople. Our flag will not participate in the liberation of the city of our dreams. The harm is irreparable." The majority of the war would see Greece divided over these two positions. Instead of outward expansion, Greek forces looked inward. A pro-Entente provisional government was established in Salonika under Venizelos, and before long it was violently clashing with a pro-neutral government in Athens. By 1917, the Entente, which had already established its forces in and around Greece, forced the country to reunite, naturally under a pro-Entente government. Constantine's son Alexander took his place on the throne thereafter. A supposedly reunited Greece would participate in the fight against the Central Powers for the rest of the war. By the war's end, it was in a great bargaining position to grab land from the losing Ottomans. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 12, 1920, please forgive my French accent, gave the Hellenic kingdom two prizes. First was a large chunk of Ottoman territory in and around Smyrna, a city along the western Anatolian coast that, according to Beaton, held the largest concentration of Greeks of any city in the world. Second, another sizable portion of land around Constantinople, but not the city itself. Regardless, the grand idea was starting to look as it had been envisioned, not just on the ground, but on the map too. This is where it's hard not to think of a Byzantine Empire reborn, because when you see what the Greek kingdom was starting to look like, you see the empire in its later days, when the bulk of it was in Greece, Thrace, and the western edges of Anatolia. Not only that, but this was a state run by Greek speakers who had leaders with names like Constantine. Surely, a new Byzantium was on the horizon, no? Well, you and I can wonder all we want, because at the end of the day, there would not be a rebirth of the Eastern Roman Empire. In fact, Greece's material gains following World War I were soon to be reversed. The Republic of Turkey, formed in 1919, would serve as the final death nail for the Ottoman Empire. Naturally, like the young kingdom of Greece in the 19th century, the goal of this new nation was to free its lands from foreign occupiers. Unfortunately for the Kingdom of Greece, that meant the lands it had just occupied were in the Republic of Turkey's crosshairs. 3 years of brutal war would follow, reaping even more horror on the Greek, Armenian, and Turkish populations in Anatolia and Thrace that barely came out on the other side of World War I. When all was said and done, Greece's post-war gains were overturned, and some 800,000 Greeks had fled Anatolia, and 250,000 more were pouring out of Thrace. But in this defeat, Venizelos saw an opportunity. If Greece could not expand to encompass the Greek people, it could at least bring them into its borders. A population exchange was agreed upon by the two states in 1923, in which Greece would take all Greek Orthodox Turkish nationals, and Turkey would take all Muslim Greek nationals. According to Beaton, for the first time since the creation of the Kingdom of Greece, the majority of Greek speakers were now within it. He writes, quote, "At a stroke, almost the entire Greek nation had now to be crammed within the existing borders of the Greek state. In a way that had never been intended, the grand idea, which had been left for dead on the battlefields outside of Smyrna, would be fulfilled after all." Greece would see another expansion later in the 20th century, but I'm inclined to agree with Beaton, who is the expert after all, that the grand idea can be said to have been accomplished in 1923. The aim was to unite the Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian peoples, and by those parameters, I'd call it mission complete by then. While we didn't get a reborn Byzantine Empire, we did get to see the Romii get darn close. But considering the death and destruction the wars of the early 20th century brought to, well, just about everyone, it's probably for the best that dreams of empire were snuffed out wherever possible. Follow Badass Stories from Byzantium on whichever social media platform you prefer. All of my handles are under Badass Byzantium. My next full episode will be released April 10th, and in it, I once again plan to get very bubonic. Hope to see you all soon, and remember, truth is the soul of history.